So today I'm sitting here with Paul. He's a teacher at the same school that I'm working at. And I'm just going to get straight to the point. Hey Paul, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yep, my name is Paul, and I work as a teacher, post-secondary, and I'm originally from Saskatchewan, but I've been living in Calgary for quite a number of years. And I was, when I first moved here, I was an itinerant teacher with what was then called the Native Education Department. Mm-hmm. And so I just traveled around from school to school, and I helped out the Indigenous kids at each school. And then I did that for 4 years, and then stumbled my way into television broadcasting. So I was a TV reporter for 12 years. And then I left that after 12, and I'm a writer. I do stand-up comedy, and I'm back to teaching again full-time too. So, yeah.
Cool. Interesting hat. What's that?
It's actually from the coffee shop, right across the street from here. But they have this really interesting merch, and this is one of the items that they have, and I really noticed it because it's just different, and it just doesn't have the logo of the coffee shop. It has this bison on it, and the foreleg, if you can see.
Oh, it's Alberta.
It's actually Alberta. Yeah, and especially being Native, being Cree, and what the buffalo meant to the Plains people for so many generations. It really stood out to me, and I like that it has the province of Alberta etched into it. So
I mean, the buffalo was a source of wealth, health.
It was everything.
Community, lifestyle.
Yep.
And then it went like in a generation. Okay, so that's just kind of getting to the point of what we're talking about.
Well, what that comes from is it's when the white European settlers were pushing west, and they just hunted it for fun. Yeah. Whereas our people used it for it. It's a sacred being, and it was supposed to be treated with respect, and that's what our people did. Because, as you know, they used everything from the buffalo, not just the meat for food. They used the hides for shelter,
the sinews, the
sinew
bones.
for everything, tools, everything. The bladder for they turned it into water vessels, and so they a very, very spiritual animal. And as the new Canadians were pushing west, they just started shooting them all for fun, and that completely depleted the buffalo to the point where it became extinct. So it was a huge turning point for the people and the culture, and it was just a symbol of the conflicting worldviews between white European society and Indigenous culture. So the white European worldview is a triangle, and you put striations across it, and on top is man. Then it's the animals, then it's the trees and the plants and such. And Indigenous worldview is a circle. And what that means is everything is connected, everything is just as important as the next thing. So that's why in our culture, the mountains just to the west of us here, they're alive, they have a spirit, they're sacred, and they're meant to be treated that way. And in the European worldview, it's nothing. It's just an inanimate object, and to be taken advantage of. That's why they quarry in the mountains, just to have stones for building things. They don't get the real significance of it. So that there was that clash, and that happened right from first contact, and that's in just very short form. Kind of reflective of where that relationship between mainstream Canada and Indigenous Canada, and there's always been that disconnect.
It had devastating effects,
of course,
on the society and on the individuals, families.
Yeah. But you know what? It didn't start off that way, because it was actually the Royal Proclamation of 1763 when King George III recognized that the Indigenous peoples of this land were sovereign nations,
Yeah.
were highly intelligent, they knew how to survive, they knew the land, knew how to coexist with it, yet they had their own cultures, their own belief systems, their own languages, and recognized that they had to deal with them on an equal footing.
Which is why chiefs went to the Queen when they were creating the Constitution. They had to kind of go and they went and saw the Queen, was it in '82, in order to say yes, we are okay with the Constitution, because the Crown has always kind of accepted the sovereignty of the nations.
Well, no, they didn't, because
but not the Crown of
but
Canada.
because they fell away from that.
Yeah,
That proclamation didn't last that long
because they
because
national interests.
yeah, exactly, and the white European worldview, where anyone of color was lesser than.
Yeah,
And then that's what started to permeate, that's what took over, and that's what led to the Indian Act, and that's what led to the formation of residential schools, then the
Indian
60
agent.
Scoop, and now it's the child welfare system.
Yeah. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but when I read the history, it seems a lot to me like genocide.
Well,
Because
that's what a
of-
lot of indigenous people have been saying for a very long time. That's
You
been a
destroy a
genocide.
language, a culture, families, nations, hunting, or their ability to live on the land. Take the land off them, put them in reserves.
Yeah.
And then infantilize the people by now you're on the reserve. You have an Indian agent who looks after you.
Yep.
When you hear someone talking about that, how do you feel?
No, well, it's
Just to be obvious.
it's well, I'm a part of that. I'm a product of the system, because I'm part of the 60 Scoop, which is where the policy was for forced assimilation was to take Native kids away from their families,
Yeah.
and then scoop them away into foster care and then into adoption. And for the adoption part of it, they used to advertise us as things in the newspapers. So I wound up being the flavor, what I always called the flavor of the month in the Regina Leader Post. So I was taken away from my mother. She didn't drink, she didn't do drugs, and they literally took me off the birthing table out the back door. And when she said, "Hey, what are you doing with my boy?" "Oh, don't worry, we're gonna bring him back. We're just gonna run some tests," or whatever the hell they said to her. And that was it. And I was immediately put into foster care. So my first 18 months, I was in a foster home, then put up for adoption. And that's what they did. They advertised us. My joke is that I was probably found between the cats and the dogs in the adoption section. So, hey, do we want to adopt this cute little tabby, or do we want little Fido? Hey, no, there's a chubby little brown kid.
Yeah.
Let's adopt him. So, and that whole thing came from trying to make these savages into white people. And so that's why they instituted the Indian Act, which led to the creation of the reservation system, which led to residential schools and the Scoop and what is now Child Family Services. And even to this day in 2023, the majority of children in care are Indigenous children. So we're still feeling those effects of colonialism and just pure systemic racism even today in 2023. And it's reflected in what's happening in the news. All this week, all we've been hearing about is another the announcements from First Nations across Canada
Grave sites.
about unmarked burial sites found through GPR, ground penetrating radar. And it just brings up all that old shit over and over and over. But there's a reason why it's called truth and reconciliation. There is no reconciliation yet. How can you reconcile a relationship that wasn't even a true relationship right from the get-go? So the truth is, I always say, it ain't reconciliation if it feels good. And the truth is that
Right.
you have to deal with these ugly things that nobody wants to talk about. And we didn't for how many years, how many decades? And it wasn't until, Alberta, I'll give Alberta Ed props for this, because they did institute residential schools has to be covered in the curriculum. And I forget what year that was, but I now know that there are students that I've had post-secondary who started studying residential schools while they were in elementary school.
Yeah.
And it's covered in junior high now, and now it's in high school. So this generation of students, and even before that, they're finally learning this stuff in the education system. But their parents and grandparents, they still don't. They're becoming more aware of it now. But it was never taught when I was coming up, and when I first started teaching, you never heard about it in the curriculum, and nobody talked about it. And the big turning point was in May of when was that? Was that is that 2 years ago now? No, a year ago.
You mean when the Pope came?
No. The discovery in Kamloops.
Yes, in Kamloops. That was about the same time, or just
That
before?
was So that was not this past May, the May before.
Yeah.
So we'll be going into 2 years since that grisly discovery in Kamloops of the 215 unmarked graves, now I think it was Blue Quills in Saskatchewan at the LeBret residential school. They discovered 2,000 anomalies. It doesn't mean that it's 2,000 unmarked graves. It just means that they found these
We
anomalies
need to check.
that they have to check now. It might just be wood or metal, right? But the chances that there are kids remains is quite high. So I'm interested to see what that is going to look like. I know on my reserve at Beardy's and Okamasas First Nation at Duck Lake, Saskatchewan, St. Michael's was the residential school there. And I was just home on my res this past summer, and I talked to one of my cousins who's on chief and council, and he told me, I got to do a little more research on this, but it was quite a big residential school. So I don't know what the enrollment was, but it was quite high. There was a lot of kids that went there, and 50% of them never came home. And I remember when I met my biological family way back in early mid-90s, and I had a nice chat with my uncle, and he told me about his experiences there, and they were just horrible. And he told me back then, he said, Paul, there are kids that died, and they took them out and they just threw them out in a hole in the ground out in the bush and just covered it up, and nothing was ever done. And that was back years ago. And so they are going to, I think they said in about 6 months or so, they were going to have enough funds to do a GPR search of my reserve. And I actually had a friend ask me. We're at my neighborhood pub, and I'll never forget. This is just before the Kamloops discovery. It's about 2 weeks before, and he was half cut, and he was sitting with his friends that were acquaintances of mine, and they're all white, and I'm the only native guy sitting at their table, and I get along with everybody, and. But my friend, he was 3 sheets to the wind. He said, Paul, he goes, when can we just let all this stuff go?
Yeah.
When can we just get over it, right? And I was like,
It's inconvenient.
Yeah. So I was kind of stunned that he would say that. And then one by one, the other guys started in on me as well. So then,
Because they'd heard him get away with it.
yeah, and I was kind of, So I put an end to that conversation right then and there. I said, you know what? I said, that's just first off, a really stupid question. So you obviously don't know shit. And you're letting the alcohol talk. And I said, this isn't a conversation we're going to have when you're half cut. and we can talk about this later, right? And not here. And so anyway, it sort of ended like that. And then it was 2 weeks later that news came out, and I ran into him again. And I said to him, well, what do you have to say now?
Yeah. What
And
did
he
you have to
did
say?
nothing. He just kind of put his head down and he just sort of looked away. And I was like, yeah, that's what I figured. So you have to deal with these things. My friend was just, I've got two friends that were at an Indigenous education conference back in October, November. And it was called, I believe it's called Braiding Together.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and in fact, Zoomless and
Yeah.
a bunch of other bigwigs, they were at that conference
Yeah.
too. So they had one of the keynotes was the woman who started the whole orange shirt day. She's from BC, and during her keynote address, this is really ugly. She talked to survivors from a residential school in BC, and I can't remember if it was Kamloops or not.
Yeah.
But during her talk, she had mentioned that these survivors told her about underage teenage girls that were impregnated by the priests at that residential school, and their pregnancies were terminated, and then the remains of these babies were thrown into the incinerator.
Yeah.
And this is just recently, and nobody's talking about that because it's too horrifying to admit.
Yeah.
So you would ask me, what are my feelings about the Catholic Church? Well, I really don't know. I really don't know, because I grew up Catholic because I was part of the Scoop. And we went to church, St. Anne Church in Regina. Every Saturday we went to the 5 p.m. Mass, 5 o'clock Mass. We did that every weekend that I grew up. And I didn't even think about it. It's just something you did, right? And I remember the reason why I enjoyed it was because you knew you didn't have to get up early on Sunday. So I enjoyed that church and that time. And I didn't think much of it as I grew up. It hasn't hit me all these personal revelations until later in my life, because I kind of went through the ringer with my whole experience, because as I found out when I was a reporter, I did a 3-part series on a report that had been, a study that was published in a sociology journal. And it was published by a prof at the U of C, and he was British. And his focus of study was on interracial adoptions, but specifically white families who had adopted Native kids.
Yeah.
And that was ironic because at that time, I'm a TV reporter now, but at that time, I was just finding my biological family at the same time as I'm doing this news story. So I asked him, I said, well, what were your findings? And he said, well, that white families should not adopt Native kids. I said, why not? He said, because it'll end up in some kind of failure. And I said, well, tell me what failure is. Quantify it for me. He said, well, it's basically the breakdown of family relationships, alcoholism, drug abuse, suicide, jail, prostitution, street gangs, like all of the worst of the worst. And it's because of this disconnect.
Yeah.
And when I grew up in Regina, there were other white families in my neighborhood that had adopted Native kids. And all those kids, when they're kids, they were really messed up. They were always in trouble. And everyone said to me, hey, you're fine, you're normal. And I was always like, well, what does normal mean, right? So it didn't affect me until I became an adult. And specifically, once I started getting into my 30s, that's when everything started to come out sideways, as one of my therapists told me. And that led to a huge downward spiral, like heavy hardcore drinking, which led to hardcore drug use for many years. And that's what it does to you. And so at some point you have to hit rock bottom to be able to start to crawl your way back out again. And so thankfully that's what's happened with me. So my life over the last several years has improved vastly compared to where it was. And so when you ask me about what my feelings are about the church, I'm still conflicted about it. I think it's great that the Pope came here, that he gave that apology, especially back in April, when he just did it on his own volition, when that delegation from Alberta went to the Vatican. And it just came out of the blue. That's why it was huge news. Nobody was expecting that. And then as soon as he did that, the word got out that, there's probably going to be a papal visit to Canada. And I think that's fantastic. That's a huge step. But we still have such a long way to go to repair all the bad. Because you're talking about 200 years of this stuff. And so that's why when you talk about reconciliation, well, it's gonna be a while yet.
This is just from my perspective. In the news today is Russia invading Ukraine. In some ways, it's almost like an analogy of what we did back in the 1800s coming to North America. We drove everyone off the land, took over, got rid of the natural resources. We wouldn't have tanks or anything, where we had trains, railways, towns. It was the same kind of occupation.
Well, again, it's that it's the contrasting worldviews, because Mother Nature is everything, and that's what's important.
Oh, yeah, it's coming back to bite us now, eh?
And certain countries have it right. Bolivia, I think in about 2015 or so, they decided to say that it's called the law of Mother Nature. And it's entrenched now in their constitution that nature has rights, just like human beings do. And they're the first country to do that. And because the people there are indigenous, and part of the reason why they did that is because their country, their ecosystems are falling apart.
Well, being devastated by mining.
Climate change, mining. We're running out of water here on planet Earth, and the reason why we're running out of water is because, for example, in Ontario and Six Nations territory, Mohawk territory, Nestle, which is now called Blue Triton, they have all these legal permits to drain the aquifers for all their products. So bottled water, pop, soda, whatever. And they're draining over 3 million liters a day out of these aquifers. Well, that's all fine and good because they're getting what they want. Somebody's making money because they have to pay for these permits, and they're doing it on traditional territory. So I'm sure the nation's making money off these land deals. However, these aquifers take 6,000 to 10,000 years to replenish. So and it's drying up. This one particular aquifer. So once it's dry, it's going to take 6,000 to 10,000 years. So we'll never, if you don't touch it. So we'll never see that replenish again in our lifetime. We're clearing land at an alarming rate to make room for mass agriculture.
Palm oil.
And for more humans to live. We hit 8 billion people just a few weeks ago. And Earth scientists were saying for years that Mother Earth can only comfortably sustain about 6 billion people. We're at 8 billion, and we're continuing to explode. So how are you going to feed? How are you going to water everybody? Well, you have to take from land, but we're not giving back.
Yeah.
And that's what you have to do. And that's the big difference between my culture and that European worldview. European worldview, land is property. It's meant to be owned for money.
And
That's
used.
it. Yep. And just use it.
Yeah.
And then when you're done with that and everything's gone, you move on to the next piece. So that's the whole problem. We're out of sync.
Okay. We'll stop there if you want, because that was a great ending.